Welcome to Your Truth. In this episode, we wanted to investigate why our corporate news outlets weren't highlighting issues that greatly affect our health, our pocketbooks, and our freedom. That's when we heard that the news didn't have to tell us the truth, and that there were no laws or regulations that made the news tell us what our corporations, our government, and what our decision makers were doing. Don't believe us? Here's one example.
With Monsanto, I didn't realize how effectively a corporation could work to get something on the marketplace. The levels of coordination they had to have. They had to get university professors into the fold. They had to get experts into the fold. They had to get reporters into the fold. They had to get the public into the fold. And of course the FDA, let's not leave them out. They had to get the federal regulators convinced that this was a fine and safe product.
We wrote the story. We had it ready a week beforehand. That Friday night before the Monday this series was to begin, the fax machine spit out a letter from this very high-priced lawyer in New York.
1 week later, Monsanto sent the second letter, and this was even more strongly worded. And it said there will be dire consequences for Fox News if the story airs in Florida. They were afraid of being sued, and they were also afraid of losing advertising dollars at all of the stations owned by Rupert Murdoch. That's 22 television stations. That's a lot of advertising dollars for Roundup, Aspartame, NutraSweet, and other products.
I said, you know, this is news. This is important. This is stuff people need to know. And I'll never forget, he didn't pause a beat, and he said, we just paid $3 billion for these television stations. We'll tell you what the news is. The news is what we say it is. I said, I'm not doing that. And he said, well, he said, if you refuse to present this story the way we think it should be presented, you'll be fired for insubordination. How about if we pay you some money and you just go away?
He was going to offer us the rest of our year's salary if we agreed not to talk about what Monsanto had done, to not talk about the Fox corporate response in suppressing the story, and to not talk about the story. Not talk about BGH, again, anywhere. Not take the story to another news organization. Just zip up.
Jane sued Fox under Florida's whistleblower statute, but her appeal court judges found that falsifying news isn't actually against the law.
After learning about this case, we investigated into what the FCC's policy was on news stations or broadcasters slanting or distorting the news. The Federal Communications Commission Consumer Fact states, as public trustees, broadcasters may not intentionally distort the news. Broadcasters are responsible for deciding what their stations present to the public. Now we know it's not against the law for corporate news to slant or distort the truth. Our next question was, could they also be censoring stories from the American public? That's when we found Project Censored, founded in 1976. Project Censored uncovers the top 25 national news stories censored by corporate media. We sat down with Professor at Sonoma State and Director of Project Censored, Peter Phillips, to get the scoop.
Every year, the project researches the most important news stories that the corporate media has uncovered. But there's people like Steve Wilson and Jane Acree at Fox TV that are trying to expose bovine growth hormone in milk, BGH. And dairy products and saying this isn't good for you. There's scientific evidence that this in your bodies can causes tumors in rats and it can be harmful. They lose their jobs over that. And Fox, tells them essentially, and they sue for, getting fired for losing their jobs because they're whistleblowers. And they ultimately lose because Fox says it's not against the law to lie to the public. And it's not. It's an FCC rule, but it's not a law. It's not a law. Certain things will start to creep into people's consciousness, and they'll realize that, wow, there's some major problems here. Students will come in and they'll see these stories and they'll be involved, and they'll come back to class and report on something. 25 other students will come back and report, and all of a sudden the lights go on and say, oh my God, I had no idea that this was out there. People in Europe, people in other parts of the world, they laugh at us. I mean, they know so much more about what's going on in the world and what the powerful are and how the military industrial media elite in the United States dominate our society in terms of what we're told and what we're informed. That it's just a propaganda control mechanism of understanding, of people knowing what the parameters are. And the problem is that, like, Pravda means truth in Russian, and the people in the Soviet Union knew that that was a government. Pravda was the government news, and that it was totally controlled, and they couldn't really necessarily believe anything, and they would try to go out and find other news sources whenever they could. Here in the United States, people don't realize that the corporate media is the Pravda of the United States. 118 people on the boards of directors of top 10 media corporations. They're interlocked with about 25% of the corporate 1,000. So yeah, they're on the oil companies, they're on the military companies, they're on the drug companies and the pesticide. I mean, all of that is interpenetrated, and so they have an agenda to protect their corporate interests.
Wait a minute. Stories are being censored to protect corporate interest? There are hundreds of different channels. It seems absurd that all of these channels are conspiring to censor information from the public. That's when we found that all of these news stations, channels, and other media outlets are all owned by 6 corporations. So how does this media structure protect the corporate elite? Well, let's start at the top. Here are the 6 corporations, or the Big 6. General Electric. You may also recognize them as NBC, Telemundo, and Universal Pictures. Walt Disney, or ABC, the History Channel, and ESPN. Viacom, or MTV, BET, and Paramount Pictures. CBS, who in 2004 split from Viacom, who owned CBS Radio, CBS Television, and Showtime. News Corporation, or Fox News, the New York Post, Wall Street Journal, and MySpace. And Time Warner Inc., or CNN, Time Magazine, or Warner Brothers. These 6 corporations have become the voice for America, but how they protect the corporate elite is still a mystery, so we investigated. Introducing the corporate family tree. Every corporation has a board of directors and executives, but they don't just serve one corporation. They sit on numerous corporate boards, think tanks, lobbies, institutions, and government agencies. For example, Alan Lewis, the independent director of Walt Disney, or ABC, and director of Halliburton, the company contracted to rebuild Iraq. Is there a conflict of interest because he sits on a media board and on Halliburton? Could the corporate board member be invested in the war? Viet Den from News Corporation, or Fox News, and author of the Patriot Act. Why is the media board member writing legislation for the government that undermines our civil liberties? And Stephen Bolenbach, who is the independent director and chairman of Finance Committee for Time Warner Inc., or CNN. He's also a consultant for Hilton Hotels, board member of CVC Capital Partners, an investment firm, chairman of the Finance Committee of Catalyst Development Corporation, a real estate investment firm, KB Homes, a housing and commercial building developer, and lead independent director of American International Group, or AIG, one of the largest insurance companies that caused the collapse of the housing market and prompted the bailout. He sits on the board of Time Warner Inc., parent company of CNN, and he also sits on the board of AIG. Could there be censoring of information on why the bailout happened and on where the projected $4 trillion bailout is going? So with all this entanglement, do you think there's a conflict of interest?
Only 6 media corporations that own...
I did.
Did you?
I am a comm major.
That's crazy.
No, I didn't know that.
I didn't know how many, but I knew that there were very few.
I would believe it.
I'd believe it too. It just sucks that there's only 6.
Well, personally, I don't think it's such a big deal.
There are so many different stories. There should be that many different news stations too to get the full story.
I think they feed off one another and kind of work together to make sure nobody releases information that they don't want us to know.
I think it's just a matter of perspective. Like, we mostly see the American media, so we get it from an American point of view, or an American corporate point of view.
Well, do you trust the media?
Not completely. I know that they all have their own agendas.
So do you trust the media at all?
No, I don't. It's all controlled.